Is winter a big pause button for a lake? Or is there something more active going on that we can't see? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, this is Jill from the North Woods, talking about nature right outside your front door. Right outside my front door, winter. It is cold, blowy, and we have been having lots of ice and snow. When winter settles in and a lake freezes over, it's easy to assume that the story is over with then. The surface is solid, the water is hidden. In fact, it was funny. I was out hiking at a lake last weekend, and the wind had pushed the lake away from the shoreline just a bit because the wind was so solidly strong in one direction. And then the ice layer itself was above the ground of the lake, and I could actually see and walk on some of what had been the lake bed and look under the ice into the lake, and it was wild. But it looks quiet and still, and the question is, what happens when a lake freezes? Is anything really alive in there? And what is happening with the lake all winter long? Because in the end, and here's the end of it, the lake hasn't stopped. It's reorganized. The fish are slowed in their movements and gathering deeper into water. The plant's energies are stored and waiting for action. Insect larvae keep feeding in the dark, and microbes are recycling what it is that's going on in the lake. And the lake itself, the water, the ice, the layers, has become carefully structured. The ice forms a lid of cold water near the surface. Slightly warmer water settles at the bottom, creating a refuge for life. And sometimes that ice expands and contracts and snaps. And that's what we're going to be doing today, is walking through this hidden winter world that's going on in a lake. Now, I do walk by a number of lakes, and so I was kind of curious, what's going on in there? I even bought a GoPro because someday I'm going to take it and I'm going to shove it into that lake and see what's down there. But the idea is, like I said, the water is still going on, even though the surface is sealed, and it sounds very quiet. When you walk around the lake in winter, it feels very quiet, like winter had just shut down the entire system. So we're going to talk about what is going on. So the first thing to understand is that ice is not the enemy of lake life. You think it is, and I think it is, but water freezes from the top down, so the ice floats on the very top and then forms a solid lid over the lake, sealing the water, but it also is protecting it from the most bitter winter air that's going on around the outside of it. Under that ice, the water stays liquid, usually just above freezing, and with the water being liquid, it means that cells don't rupture. Like if we get frostbite, that's what happens. Our cells rupture. Gills can still extract oxygen, and life continues, even though it's a little bit slower than it was before. Snow, if it forms on top of the ice, often makes things even better. The snow acts as insulation, trapping some of the heat underneath the water, and so the ice and the temperature becomes more and more stable. The frozen surface you see is actually what makes winter survival possible for what's going on in the lake. The fish themselves, like I said, don't freeze. They don't sleep through winter either. They just downshift. As the water cools, the fish metabolism slows down. Their bodies need less food. They become less movement, and they need less oxygen. And so oftentimes you'll find them in deeper parts of the lake where the temperature is a little bit more stable. If you ever watch those survival shows like Alone in Alaska kind of thing, once the lake freezes over, what do? They go walk out into the middle of the deep part of the lake and they drop a line in because that's where all the fish are. So you oftentimes see perch and trout will remain relatively active and even feeding occasionally. The bass and sunfish move very little and conserve more energy. And many fish are just hovering around, barely moving their fins, making it through the winter. A fish won't chase prey that they might in the summertime because they're trying in the wintertime to conserve energy and conserve their movements, everything costs, in wintertime. So winter is about survival for a fish, and it's about efficiency and not strength or dominating all the other fish. If you have aquatic plants, they're waiting. They're not gone. They don't die. They die back, but they are off of uh, the lake surface, they will have died back. But down at the bottom, the roots and the tubers and the rhizomes, those are the things that go under and, like if you have anything invasive above land and they spread through roots, they remain alive in the sediment of the lake itself. And plants like pondweed and water lilies, which we think of as being on top of the lake, their leaves decay, the stems collapse, and all the energy is stored underground. Some of those plants will stay even green underneath the ice, especially in more clear lakes where light can penetrate through. They're still getting enough to do photosynthesis. And so they will remain green and still produce small amounts of oxygen. These plants are one of the reasons that the fish can survive all winter long and still be breathing. So they're just hanging out and waiting. The insect larvae are winter specialists in this part of the woods. We know that because the lake just below has all bunches of insect larvae in there, juvenile forms of insects that are waterborne and someday will fly. Things like mayflies, dragonflies, midges, annoying things, all live in the kind of the soft mud. And these insects spend months of the year just waiting, never seeing the outside. And in wintertime, they're feeding on decayed plant matter. They're moving very slowly. They provide fish with food as well. And they're just perfectly adapted for the cold. I think I told you before in past editions where I go camping, and we camp regularly at this one particular lake, and we are on this island in the lake. And one day, it was night, it was like 10 o'clock at night, all of a sudden we hear this zzz. It sounded like an alien invasion. My friend and I were like, what is that? And so we start walking around on the path trying to figure out what kind of noise is that. It sounded like 100 little drones flying over the lake. And what it was were all the mayflies being birthed out of the water. It finally got warm enough where one night they spawned and the next day they were everywhere. And it was amazing. And I forgot, I had a stat when I did a podcast about it, how many tons, millions of tons of food that is to birds and everything else. But they're waiting inside that lake for that day. And like I said, providing a little bit of food for the fish. There's snails, worms, small crustaceans, crawfish and crayfish and all the things that you have at the bottom. And they're still continuing too. The snails will kind of scrape around along the algae from surface to surface. The worms tunnel through the sediment and the tiny crustaceans drift slowly around in the water. These creatures are constantly recycling nutrients, turning dead material, think about dead plants and microbes so that they can use again and eat them. And it just doesn't get much attention, but the system that is active in the summertime is still active in the wintertime. And it really depends heavily on these small little lives to kind of recycle materials inside of that lake. And then we think too about microbes, and microbes are the invisible workforce, right? That even in near freezing water, microbes are still active. The bacteria breaks down the dead plants and the dead animals, releases nutrients back into the system. And as they release gas, as they release, needs material, they release gases like methane and carbon dioxide. A lot of times you might see bubbles in the lake of the ice. That's evidence that life is still going on right up to the moment where the lake's sealed over with ice. So they don't stop either. They are just patient and persistent and doing their job. Then the last thing is you think about amphibian and other bottom dwellers. They're small frogs and salamanders that overwinter underwater. They tuck themselves into the mud or leaf litter around the sides of the lake, but they barely move for months. Oxygen goes in and out through their skin and the surrounding water. And so their survival depends on all the other pieces, the stable temperature, the oxygen that's going on. So this is a real winter retreat. Cold rarely kills lake life. Oxygen loss, if it happens greatly, could kill lake life off, but that doesn't usually happen to that degree. And when the ice is thick and the snow blocks the light, the plants stop producing oxygen, the microbes keep consuming it, and the fish and amphibians could suffer because of the plant's lack of producing oxygen. but usually it's not quite so bad. So certainly a really tough winter can lead to fish kill, but it's because the system runs out of oxygen. So winter is a very careful balance, and it's certainly there's no guarantees. Living outside right in the winter time. I think when I thought it was a kid, I thought winter was the absence of life, and instead it's about it's everything using its advantage in the most harsh condition and just waiting it out. And I think that shows a lot of resilience from nature. So that's the idea. I go every year once it gets a little bit more cold because I don't trust the ice. Once it gets thick enough, I go and usually walk out onto a lake because it's kind of fun and exciting to do. And you'll see bubbles, you'll notice patterns in the snow. And, sometimes I need to take a deeper look to see what I can see deep down inside. One of the lakes I go walking on is crystal clear. Now, the next point I want to make is that winter is not chaotic. It's very, very organized. And I want to talk about the lake layers. So the lake on the ice, like I said, seals off the top, and the water itself sorts itself into various layers underneath. And the temperature has a lot to do with the various layers. First of all, like I said, we get the top layer, ice. And sometimes it has snow on it. It's not just, like I said, frozen water. It also protects everything that's going on below it. And that ice blocks the worst of the air, prevents the heat from escaping too quickly, and stops the wind from stirring the waters and making them even more cold. But once we have that ice, there's a couple layers in there. One of them is called Ipolymian, and it's the coldest water. It's just below the ice layer. And in the summertime, that layer is usually warm and lively and active. But in wintertime, it's the coldest liquid in the entire lake. It's usually somewhere right at the freezing point because the water above it is frozen. So it is very close to being frozen. Fish avoid it, and movement is really minimal. And life at that particular level is very sparse because it is so cold. It is the boundary zone for the cold buffer, between the ice and the rest of the lake. Then there's something called the thermocline, and that's the transition zone. And below that first layer is the thermocline, and it is a place of change, I guess. It's where the temperature shifts from very, very cold, almost freezing, to slightly warmer. And in that area, just because it is slightly warmer, it is not so harsh. It's much more stable. And it also slow mixing of water, because remember, temperature is what mixes things. We talked about air, like warm air rises and cold air sinks, little bit of mixing in there. And so it stays organized within that particular layer. Then the last one is called the hypolimnian, and that is really the refuge. That is the most important layer when we're talking about the lake, because the temperature down there, the water is the most dense, and it sinks to the bottom, and then life gathers there. That's where the fish are, the amphibians, the insect larvae, everything that's going on is in that very bottom layer. And it tends also to be very stable, doesn't move around much, very dark, and so it also makes it very energy efficient for things to hang out there. So everything is really kind of in those particular layers, and that's what's going on below the lake level when you're kind of taking a look at it. And the last thing to talk about when it comes to what's going on in a lake is sometimes they can make really incredible cracking or even almost like a weird guitar sound. My friend and I were walking, like I said, around the lake, and all of a sudden we heard this it sounded like a guitar string going twang, but it was very deep and it was very loud, and it made this incredible noise. What can happen is that ice is very brittle itself, and suddenly there's pressure that can crack the ice. It can snap, it can crackle, it can groan, and the sound is the pressure being released. And it was, like I said, very loud crack. And I thought, oh my gosh, the ice is cracking. So we ran down to the shore to look and saw no cracks. Obviously, there's many layers we just talked about. And so what is happening is it's releasing tension, kind of adjusting shape a little bit and redistributing some of the stress across the surface, maybe a little bit like what an earthquake does, but just on a smaller scale. And so there may be cracks that open and then seal up directly again because obviously the water would fill it in and freeze again. So these ice crystals form uh, along a network and they lock together and they don't all expand and contract at exactly the same rate. And cracks, like I said, can form, and fractures, pressure ridges can form inside the sheet ice itself. And then suddenly there's the ice, which transmits sounds very well. By the way, if you don't live in a cold area, one of the most amazing things about very super cold winters is you can hear everything. The noise, because there's less moisture in the air, you can hear farther away than you can normally hear. So I don't live that terribly far from a highway. I don't hear it in summertime, but in wintertime, I can hear it crystal clear, even through my closed windows, because vibrations move better, sound waves move better in the cold. And same thing with the lake. Vibrations move quickly through a lake. The surface of the lake acts like a giant soundboard, and then the sounds can echo across a long distance. It also happens that you'll hear these types of noises at different times of the day. Sunset, when the temperature is dropping fast, or even late night when the deepest cold settles in for the evening. And in this particular case, when I heard the noise, it was early morning, and that is when the temperatures are slowly rising and the ice starts tightening. So the different types of environments can produce different kinds of sounds, and the sharp cracks might be a sudden fracture. The long groans, which I guess would be a little bit what I heard, comes from that pressure shift, and booming sounds can often happen right when it is releasing that stress in the ice. So it is kind of an interesting thing because the ice itself will remain solid, even though there's liquid underneath. Whenever there's surface cracks, they almost self-repair. And when this happens, it's just adjusting and readjusting the stress so that everything can just stay, in level with the lake itself. So I hope that helps you understand winter lakes a little bit more. Love winter lakes. And if you get a chance, go take a walk around a nice winter lake. And in my area, we have a lot of lakes. And I've probably been around, probably about a dozen small lakes in this area in wintertime, and each of them kind of have their own nature to it. So I hope that helps. I hope you enjoy knowing a little bit more about nature. One of the things that I do with this podcast is that the idea is that it's not a deep dive into anything, but it's just giving you the idea that something's going on outside in nature, a little bit like the oceanic conveyor or something like that. And you can go find a book. You like bears, go find yourself a bear book. You're interested in the oceanic conveyor, there's books about that too. And if you love lakes, there's a really fantastic book about water from a guy named Tristan Goulia. He's one of my favorite nature authors. But learn a little bit more about what's going on in the world around you. I appreciate it and have a great day.